Alex Minshull from Bristol City Council. He's a Sustainable City and Climate Change Services Manager, which covers quite a lot. I don't know what you do with the rest of the week. I understand you've led Bristol City Council sustainability and climate change work for over 15 years, working with a team of professionals responsible for the City Council's environmental performance, air quality management, sustainable development, climate change, and the Council's response to the ecological crisis. Yeah, so quite a wide remit. And you work with a lot of the partners across Bristol, so I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit about what you've been up to. Over to you.
Okay. Thanks very much for having me today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Bristol's action on climate change. I just want to firstly to say thank Vanessa for making me feel very much at home today, because she's provided me with this perfect lanyard, which is was from Bristol's European Green Capital Year in 2015. So that's very kind. It makes me feel very at home and slightly nostalgic. Hopefully this should work. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the kind of the timeline of activity in Bristol around climate change, and 2015 is one of those landmarks. I'll talk a bit about the climate emergency and the declaration that was made and how we're then responding to that. I'll then talk a little bit about our One City climate strategy, and then a few of the key initiatives that we've got, but we've only got a limited amount of time, so that will be a few highlights really, just to give you a breadth of things. And I'm not going to be talking about the technology bit as well. So Lionel will be very much talking on the technology bit. I'm going to be talking much more about the kind of strategy and in some ways the people bits of it. So we've been, as just by the intro, we've been banging on about this climate change thing for quite a long time. And we've been working on it as an organisation since about 2000, when we developed the old Local Agenda 21 work, if you can, some of us will remember that. And we've had a climate strategy since 2004, and been refreshing that over the last 16 years. And what part of what we did when we created that first strategy was sort of lobbying government for the Climate Change Act with other cities and with Friends of the Earth and other organisations to try and get that act, that bill turned into that act. And that's about creating the enabling conditions, because what is clear is that local authorities, cities cannot solve climate change, achieve net zero on their own. They can only do that if the conditions that are created by nationally are conducive to that. But we have always been trying to push harder and faster than the national context. And that sort of makes sense to me. And I suppose we were European Green Capital in 2015, which is in some ways a recognition of that ambition and the work that we were doing to realise it. And then when we declared the climate emergency in 2018 rather, the council declared that as the first local authority in the UK to do so, but obviously not the first globally. It was a bit of a moment of shift from when we shifted from having 2050 targets, which are well beyond my retirement date, and many mayors' terms of office, to 2030, which is actually before my retirement date, and only two elections away. And it shifts the focus somewhat. And so that's been crucial. And then what we, ignore the bits in the bottom. What we then developed in 2020, in March 2020, which was great timing in one regard and awful timing in another, for reasons you'll all be aware of, was our One City climate strategy. And the reason it's called, and I'll talk a bit more about that. I suppose it's worth just saying as well, within Bristol, the local authority declared the climate emergency, but then so did both of the universities, so did both the hospital trusts, so did cultural institutions, museums, theatres and the like. And that kind of collective effort and collective desire has been really important, and what we're trying to really focus on. And then this was the view from City Hall on the day that Greta Thunberg arrived. I'm down there in the crowd somewhere, not taking this picture, but fortunately we had a colleague who was able to. what we know about Bristol's population and the people that I work for is they're very concerned about climate change, and they're concerned about climate change in every part of the city, and they're concerned about climate change in every demographic. The levels vary a little bit, but actually what we've seen in recent years is not so much that the overall level of concern changes, but the level of concern in the population groups that were least concerned before has been shooting up their agenda. Does that make sense? So since it's an emergency, I thought I'd do a quick situation report on the emergency state and what we've done so far. So I used to be responsible for civil protection work within the city, and the result, we kind of borrowed some of the emergency response model from the civil protection model. So we've created our own kind of gold command, which is a strategic coordinating group, which is the One City Environment Board. They're not quite in command, but it's the nearest thing we've got to that. We've also created a scientific advisory cell, which is the Bristol Advisory Committee on Climate Change, and one of the co-chairs is sitting here, Jim Longhurst from the University of West of England, and your president, who's actually, if this lanyard's good, I think his is even better today. And they're both working really well, although I'm nervously waiting to find out what the committee is going to say on our progress in the next annual report. Having your homework marked by people like that is quite daunting. We've also had the Mayor produced an initial action plan, which we've been implementing, and we're sort of just now in the process of refreshing. And we developed the climate strategy, and importantly, we developed an evidence base underneath that. And one of the things that's helped us to do is be able to focus on what are those enabling conditions that we need to achieve. So I've trailed this strategy a few times, but this is, so you think, one city, what's that about? So because it's very clear that the council responsible for now about 0.5% of the city's emissions directly, territorial emissions, and able to influence some more tens of percent, pick a number, argue it how you want to, we can't achieve net zero carbon neutrality on our own. And so it's really crucial that the business community, that institutions and that citizens are all part of that process, hence the One City climate strategy. And that's very much an approach which our mayor has set out when he was elected first time, which is 6 years ago, I suppose now, 5 or 6 years ago, set out that need for the collective effort. And in many ways, if people have been around local government for a while, they might be familiar with things like local strategic partnerships. It's a sort of similar model to that in the past. And so we set out this vision for Bristol to be carbon neutral and climate resilient. And when we made the emergency declaration, that was all about net zero, but actually, and reducing emissions, but actually we wanted to make sure that resilience was an integral part of our strategy and was not the kind of poor cousin and the afterthought, which it so often is in discussions about climate change. But also that we wanted to make sure we could realise the co-benefits of action on climate change, whether those are economic or social or other environmental benefits or health benefits indeed. And we also thought it was important to set out some principles about how do you achieve the kind of scale. With that scale and pace of change, it's really important that you do things in a principled way. And so we set out some principles. And the first one, not by chance, is that transition should be fair. And so we've set out that as a principle, and we're trying to enact that through the work that we're doing all the time, and hopefully be able to reveal that in a few of the examples that we see here. And then the other ones, just in case anyone can't read them, they're about being collaborative, very much the kind of one city approach. It's transformative because it's not business as usual plus a bit anymore. It does need to have transformational actions. We don't know all the answers, and therefore we need to learn as we go. And that learning and making mistakes and taking risks is all part of that process. But also we need to proceed with evidence where we can. And I'll touch on a bit of that in a moment more. And the strategy sets out activity around 10 themes, and these are all the areas of both our territorial emissions, but also our imported emissions and consumption-based emissions. It's one thing to say we've focused on the whole lot, focus on the whole lot. No, we are trying to do the whole lot, not necessarily focused. And that in itself is quite an interesting challenge of trying to go 3 times as fast and do 3 times as much, which makes it 9 times as hard. Actually, it's much more than that. But what we've tried to do in our program, the current program that we're working through now, sort of a year in, is set out 4 levels of 4 types of interventions that we're making. And these actually predate, but were very nicely reinforced by the National Committee on Climate Change's report to government on the 6th carbon budget and the role of local authorities, which set out the way in which local authorities can impact on carbon emissions. And it's going to be hard to read, and particularly on the screen, but the first one is about our direct control, and that's the 0.5% that I talked about. But then also the procurement and commissioning work that we do. And for us, that we think that's probably of the order of 6 to 10 times more than that direct footprint. Then our role in place shaping, transport, planning, etc. And then how we showcase activity within the city, innovation, good practice sort of stuff. Then our partnerships and role of bringing organizations together. And they then put the final circle of involving, engaging and communicating with citizens. And I've in my work, I showed this as a pyramid actually, where unless you do the bottom, which is the council's own activities, it's very hard to proceed to the next levels because you're not credible. It's very hard for us to say to citizens, we want you to act, or to partners that we want you to act, if we haven't already sorted ourselves out. And so that's why in our part of the leading by example bit, the mayor set objective for us to be target for us to be carbon neutral, scope 1 and 2. So our direct emissions really by 2025. And that's a pretty challenging target. We've already made reductions since 2005 when we started, of the order of about 60 to 70% if you take that scope. The reason I'm vague about that is we weren't using the scope precisely when we started that process, and so we can't quite backcast the data fully. But that's the sort of, we've come quite a long way, but it also means we've got the really hard stuff to do now. So how do you get 3,000 buildings off gas heating? That's one of the challenges we've got to do. How do you get, it's not 3,000, it's not 3,000 in that scope, but that's in our total estate. But there's some really tough challenges. How do we stop using gas in crematoria? How do we light the city at night in a zero carbon way? And those are things that we're all working through at the moment. Sorry, I should have moved on the slide, but also our scope 3 emissions are really important. And so because we build quite a bit of stuff, we've got a sort of £1 billion capital program, and how we decarbonise that and ensure that contributes to resilience and to sort of nature recovery is really important as well. And that's sort of part of our strategic delivery in the city. I just want to talk about a couple of examples. One of those, as part of the evidence base, we identified what we thought the costs of decarbonising the city, scope 1 and sort of territorial emissions of the city would be: energy, transport. And we come to a figure of about £9.2 billion. I know you can take the mickey out of the 0.2, but that was the sort of estimate of it. What we've set out to do, though, is try and see how much of that money we can secure in a private sector partnership. And we're currently procuring a thing called the City Leap Energy Partnership. And what we hope that will do is deliver at least £1 billion investment into sustainable energy infrastructure in the city over the coming 10 years or so. What we've also been doing, and the mayor's been doing a lot in the last couple of weeks at COP, at the investment day and at the cities day, is articulating the case for that investment for the UK cities as part of an initiative called the UK Climate Change Investment Commission, to say that carefully. What we've done is try to do a similar exercise with the core cities, so the major cities such as Birmingham, Nottingham, Newcastle and London, to identify the investment requirements across the UK in those major cities, and then to be able to kind of take that to government, take that to the market, and kind of create hopefully some interesting investment that will help us do that. But in Bristol, we're a bit ahead of that. and hopefully next year we will have our partner in place who can then help us really deliver that, bringing not only the private sector's finances, but also their capabilities and capacity. You know, we always said if we were building our district heating network at the current rate with the council's resources, it would be 2100 and something before we got a network that was, you could call a city network. And we're hoping this will accelerate that significantly. Thank you. And we've also have in Bristol, we're very fortunate in having a network called the Bristol Green Capital Partnership, which was formed actually ahead of the creation, ahead of the creation of the European Green Capital Award. Actually, there was a little bit of prescience on our part. But that network now has 1,000 organisations in it. And what they're able to do is bring together people so that they're not on their own on the journey, on the net zero journey. And one of those things that they've been doing with the business network in the city called Business West is running a thing called the Climate Leaders Group, which is organisations who've committed to net zero by 2030 and are now kind of providing a kind of peer support group for that, able to access the existing sort of knowledge that is around the city and the region, but also able to provide short circuit that learning process. And we held an event on the 4th of November as part was one of the official regional COP fringe events. And we're hoping for a lot more businesses now to make that commitment and join that network. For citizens, we've also done a number of things. So the first of it was a kind of information base. When we declared the emergency, people kind of say, well, what can I do? And that was my working title for the website before we got a proper name, was we're helping to provide information and advice to people for what they can do to tackle climate change. And now we're including a lot more kind of video stories of ordinary people doing kind of ordinary things that are all helping to contribute to the climate change, whether that's people cycling to work or other things like that. But it's not showing people like me. It's not showing me cycling to work on my Brompton stereotypical, white environmentalist. And part of that agenda is also trying to be much more inclusive about who's involved in the conversation. Not only are we need to be planning the city with the whole community, but we need to ensure that everyone's got a voice in that. And one of the things we recognised some years ago was that the Black and minority ethnic community wasn't well represented in environmental discussions. And it wasn't part of that. It wasn't because those communities were not concerned about the issues, just they weren't necessarily always in the right rooms to do that. And so the Black and Green Ambassadors Programme is one which seeks to identify kind of people from the Black and minority ethnic community who are able to voice the interests of those communities, to become champions for those communities, to bring their perspectives into the rooms where decisions are being made, and to advocate for action that is much more inclusive and fair in the transition. And they're not just focused on climate change. They choose, each ambassador as they come on for a year, choose their own topics. Two of those ambassadors that we just saw were presenting at COP, as in Green Zone events at COP as part of that. So they were very interested in climate change this year, kind of unsurprisingly. But we also wanted to enable communities. It's all very well individuals acting, but it's much more powerful if communities can act together and we can act as collectives, both at a city scale or global scale. In fact, of course, thinking about COP, but at a city scale and at community neighbourhood level. And so we were able to support a number of communities and the Green Capital Partnership to secure funding from the lottery as part of their Community Climate Action Programme. And so 6 communities, 4 communities of place, so neighbourhoods, and 2 communities of interest, one of which is the Bristol Disability Equality Forum, are working on developing their own climate action plans, and they'll be ready in about February. And then hopefully we could, and then we'll be, the fun bit will come about trying to turn those plans into action. But for example, one of those communities, not directly related to their plans, has just signed a lease with the City Council for some land and has got funding in place for England's largest onshore wind turbine in the port area of Bristol, and that community sort of looks out over the port area. And then we also wanted to kind of plan what we were doing at a city scale with the input of citizens. And so back in the spring of this year, yeah, it all gets a bit of a blur, doesn't it, time frames in the last couple of years. But spring of this year, we did a citizens assembly looking at both how do we recover from the pandemic, because we kind of were thinking it was getting towards the end then. Sorry, that sounded far too flippant. Sorry, that was. But also, how do we tackle climate change? And one of the things that people talked about was sort of residential decarbonisation. Thank you very much indeed. I hope that's.